Hello, I am Leo Lefebvre of Georgetown University, and I am delighted to welcome you to this discussion of the theological legacy of Gerard Mannion. Gerard was deeply concerned for the rights of all people, especially indigenous communities around the world. And so in honor of Gerard, I would like to begin by paying my respects to the indigenous communities, their elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging, and their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. Gerard was a vibrant, animating figure in our communities and our lives, always dreaming of new adventures, building connections, sparking conversations, nurturing younger scholars, and planning the next international conference. It was exactly 1 year ago today that Gerard departed from this world, leaving his friends, family, and colleagues in a state of shock and grief. So today, on the first anniversary of his passing, we gather to reflect on his enduring contributions to the field of theology and to the world community. Grounded in his identity as a son of Ireland and of the Catholic heritage, Gerard lived at the crossings of many roads, negotiating the boundaries between church and society, dialoguing with various Christian communities and different religious traditions. His mentor, Keith Ward of Oxford University, recalled Gerard as a born reconciler without watering down the differences between diverse thinkers, but with a capacity for decreasing animosity between them. This clearly stood him in good stead for his future as a Catholic theologian. I would like to acknowledge the support of our sponsoring organizations, each of which reflects an aspect of Gerard's legacy. 3 are units of Georgetown University. I thank especially our hosts at the William R. Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, where Gerard was a senior fellow. I acknowledge the Initiative in Global Irish Studies, which Gerard co-founded and led and was very dear to his heart. And finally, I acknowledge the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, where Gerard held the Amaturo Chair of Catholic Studies. I would also like to recognize Ecclesiological Investigations, the international research network that Gerard founded and inspired. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to the event page on the Berkley Center's website soon. If you registered for today's event, you will also receive an email with the video when it becomes available. In the last part of our meeting today, we will welcome questions and comments from the audience. So I invite you to please submit your remark by opening the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and typing in your question or comment. Please include your affiliation. Guiding our discussion today are 2 colleagues who were long associated with Gerard. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Patricia Madigan, affectionately known as Trish, who joins us from Australia. Trish is an Australian Dominican sister who is a leader in ecumenical and interfaith relations in the Catholic Church in Australia and beyond. I also welcome Dr. Dale Irvin, who is a founding faculty member of the New School of Biblical Theology and an adjunct in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. And he currently serves as chair of the Ecclesiological Investigations International Research Network. And so now I would like to invite Dale to tell us more about ecclesiological investigations.
Thank you, Leo, and welcome everyone. Ecclesiological Investigations is an international network of scholars that was founded by Gerard Mannion and others some 15 years ago. Its main purpose from the beginning has been to promote research, dialogue, and collaboration in the study of ecclesiology across the broad spectrum of the Christian tradition, and increasingly in dialogue with other religious communities. An abiding principle of the network is that the church must be both open and inclusive in character, if it is to be true to itself and relevant to the wider world in a positive sense. As a network, we gather regularly for conferences, consultations, and seminars. Many of these events we sponsor with other organizations such as the Berkley Center at Georgetown University here today. And I want to take this opportunity on behalf of Ecclesiological Investigations to thank the Berkley Center for working with us to make this happen. A quick public service announcement. Our next event with the Berkley Center will be on Wednesday, November 18th, beginning again at 2 p.m. East Coast Time, USA. And it's going to be on the proto-ecumenical dialogue of Abba Michael of the Ethiopian Orthodox Communion and Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon, two 16th century Protestant reformers. That conversation is going to be led by David Daniels of McCormick Theological Seminary with other scholars from around the world who've been working on this unique conversation that took place in the middle of the 16th century, in the first decades of the 16th century. You will see information on this coming up soon on the Berkley webpage. One of the enduring characteristics of ecclesiological investigations that was bequeathed to us in no small part by Gerard Mannion himself is a commitment to celebrating and enjoying one another's company in all of our gatherings, making it truly a delightful venture to be a part of. If you want to learn more about ecclesiological investigations and be part of the network, we invite you to visit our webpage at ei-research.net. There's no cost, and we certainly invite you to join and be a participant in all that we're doing. Thank you, Leo.
I would like to introduce our two first speakers, Mark Chapman and Vladimir Latinovic. Mark Chapman is Professor of the History of Modern Theology at the University of Oxford and Vice Principal of Ripon College, Cuddesdon, the largest seminary in the Church of England. He has written widely on all aspects of modern church history and theology, and is an Anglican priest and a member of the Church of England's General Synod. He is Vice Chair of the Ecclesiological Investigations International Research Network and co-editor of the forthcoming book, Changing the Church, Transformations of Christian Belief, Practice and Life, with Vladimir Latinovic. Vladimir Latinovic is a lecturer in patristics at Tübingen University, where he previously was a research fellow at the Institute for Ecumenical and Interreligious Studies. He is also project manager of Treasure of the Orient, a project which seeks to improve integration and visibility of Near Eastern and Orthodox Christians in Germany. He is also a vice chair of the Ecclesiological Investigations International Research Network and co-editor of Changing the Church, Transformations of Christian Belief, Practice and Life. Mark and Vladimir will now speak about their book.
Thank you very much, Trish. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a great privilege really to be able to start this symposium this afternoon in your time anyway, this evening in my time, as we reflect on Gerard's legacy, his theological legacy. Gerard died, as we've heard, exactly a year ago today, and he died tragically young. For me personally and professionally, it's still a great loss. Gerard, for those who knew him, was a great networker and introduced so many of us to one another and made things happen. His unique combination of passion, hard work and charm made it very hard to say no to him, especially when well lubricated. And I must admit that without him, I would probably never have become an active ecumenist. We were brought together when I was a young lecturer and he was a graduate student in Oxford. I had a couple of, I'd taken a group of doctoral students over to Bonn for an exchange between the two faculties, and we were taken to see a Donizetti opera, which we dutifully sat through. I'm not given much to opera at the best of times, and it must be said this was a truly awful opera. So we said our thank yous to our hosts, and once they were safely out of earshot, I remember saying, I don't know about you, but I need a beer. And then 5 hours later, Gerard and I were good friends, and we remained so right through Gerard's increasingly global career, which saw him work in Britain, in Belgium, in Germany, and in the USA. In many ways, I suppose Gerard and I were very unlikely friends. Despite Gerard having lived in England through the whole of his childhood, he was very proud of not being British, but of being Irish. His Irish and his Catholic identity shaped how he defined himself and who he was. And of course, I'm British. What's more, I'm a Church of England priest who's sworn his oath of allegiance to the Crown, to the Queen. And even worse, I have absolutely no interest whatsoever in rugby. And you'll all be aware that the legacy of the relationships between the British Crown and Ireland are highly contested and highly complex. The bloody history of Anglo-Irish relations is something that neither of us could ever forget. But I think the basis of our friendship was that both of us could understand that all our identities were dependent on something far bigger than the vagaries of our own personal and national histories. We were both children of the one God, and we sought to apply the gospel of Jesus Christ as best we could, despite our differences in context and identity. We were proud of our identities, but we didn't see them as static and immutable. A commitment to change and to justice was the basis of our friendship, and it lay behind the initiative that led to the creation of ecclesiological investigations about 15 years ago now. So when Vladimir and I were thinking about how best to remember Gerard, we thought that nothing could be more appropriate than a volume on change in the church. In many ways, the whole of Gerard's career was dedicated to that subject. Gerard passionately loved the Catholic Church, and yet there was much in that church that he loved that he wanted to change, and changed fundamentally. In fact, his whole career was dedicated to making that change happen, and often standing up to those who resisted such changes. And many of us who stood with him in seeking to bring about change, even if sometimes it was only in very small ways. Those of us in the Ecclesiological Investigations Network have tried to do it through bringing a range of voices to the debate, often younger scholars, often female scholars, often people of colour, and people from right across the globe, and often people who find it very difficult to get a seat at the table. And we've sought to learn through encounter and through dialogue. And that's how we've challenged our deeply held identities, so that we can pass them on re-energized and transformed into the future, so that we can change and the future can be changed. Now, in all this, I think the underlying question is how we can preserve our ecclesial identity, while at the same time allowing that identity to change to increasingly bear witness to the gospel itself. Now, in my own Church of England, when clergy are licensed to a parish, they make a declaration that they will proclaim afresh the faith that is uniquely revealed in the Holy Scriptures and set forth in the Catholic creeds. It's a promise that is about continuity and change. It's about telling the story of our identity that we always have, to use a new language and to gain insights from the world around us. And that in turn will lead to new ways of understanding that treasury of faith that we've inherited. So change comes through engagement with a tradition that is no dead deposit, but something that is alive. And it's alive because ultimately it's rooted not in the church, but in the living voice of the one in whom all of us live and move and have our being. So Vladimir and I decided to gather together as many of Gerard's friends as we could to write on change from their own perspective. We didn't want it to be a book of memories, but a book for the future, to continue Gerard's work. And the list of authors is, I suppose, in many ways, something of a who's who in ecclesiology. And most of the book is highly contextual. The contributors have reflected on their own experience of change, or they sought to draw out lessons from the past or from what's going on in the present. We'd originally hoped that we might have copies to give out at a conference where we'd all be able to gather together in Georgetown. And only in February, I met with Leo and John Borelli to talk about what we might be able to do. But since then, we've all experienced a time of unprecedented change. None of us could have imagined what was soon going to happen to our world. And publishing, like so much else, has been dramatically affected by the crisis. But the book will be out a little bit later in the year. It's now in press. Of course, there's obviously been many personal tragedies through the pandemic, and it'll take us many years to learn its lessons. And much that we've taken for granted is no longer possible. So those wonderful conferences in many different parts of the world where we could talk about ecclesiology, all of those are on hold. So we've now grown used to video conferencing and to sitting at home on our own, talking into a screen. Relationships have changed and the bonds of friendship have had to be imagined in new ways. So for all of us, it's a time of experimentation and trial and error. But alongside this pandemic crisis, we can also see increasing polarization across our world, perhaps most obviously so in the United States. It seems that our belief in a common humanity rooted in a common creator is under threat from those who should be serving the common good. The model of dialogue and openness that we've sought to promote in our network seems quite alien from so much of what is happening across the world today. And these are things that can sometimes make us despair. But Gerard's legacy is about hope, and we can begin to express that hope in a small way. And what we're doing today is remembering the legacy of somebody who was firmly rooted in who he was, but who stood up for justice in the church and had hope that the world could be changed through what the church could be made to be. And all of us can be encouraged to do something of the same. Gerard's was not a kind of whinging cynicism that's so beloved of many people in the church, but the belief that things really could be better. And I hope that our volume bears witness to the belief that change is possible. And Gerard's legacy will depend on the rest of us whose mission remains to change the church to make it ever more a beacon of justice and truth. It's a tall order, no doubt, but changing the church in hope remains a continuing inspiration for the post-COVID future. Thank you.
As you have heard from this brief description given by Mark, the book dedicated to the memory of our dear friend and a colleague, Gerard Mannion, contains a very wide range of topics which addresses the issue of change in the past and future. We have deliberately chosen not to use the more conventional term reform to describe the processes that have taken place and still are taking place in our churches. This has to do with the fact that reform is often used to discuss attempts to keep some of the old while fixing only what needs to be fixed. It is our firm belief, and we are sure Gerard would agree with us, that reform is sometimes simply not enough. A road can be patched only a certain number of times, after which it becomes unusable. It then needs to be completely resurfaced or replaced by a new road. This is undoubtedly the case with some of the urgent things that need to be changed in the church. Most importantly, the handling of clerical abuse, as well as many other ways in which we exploit our fellow creatures and the wider environment, along with many other urgent matters. The approach to such issues truly needs to change if there is to be any future in this world. Of course, many smaller things can be reformed, but only to a certain point and only to ensure that we do not completely lose our direction. How this can be done can be seen in many of the contributions, 40 altogether, in the volume we collected and edited in his honor. This book is one of those books of which Mark and I are proud of. But it was Gerard's sudden death that was the occasion for this volume dedicated to his memory and his passion for change. It was a change for which none of us was prepared, and only the good Lord knows why he was taken so prematurely at the height of his academic powers and his life. In his relatively short existence, Gerard wrote and edited almost 24 books, some of them together with Mark and myself. Although they were all of very high quality, none of them can be described as his magnum opus. He was actually working on what we thought would be his magnum opus when he died. This was a multi-volume project, The Art of Magisterium, a teaching church that learns, which was to be published with Liturgical Press. Nevertheless, we would like to believe that this volume, which he edited, represents his magnum opus, because his greatest achievement was drawing together a remarkable group of scholars and people into a network that pushes the boundaries of ecclesiology and ecumenism. I'm of course referring to the Ecclesiological Investigation International Research Network. Besides talking about this volume, I thought a lot about what else I want to speak here tonight, or today for some, on this occasion of commemorating the death of our dear friend instead of commemorating his life, or better to say, commemorating life with him, as we did on so many occasions. And this second topic on which I want to say a few words is packing the life. This, of course, requires some explaining. As one of Gerard's close friends and as someone who knew a lot about his past and current projects, I was asked by his family and by the Georgetown University if I would be willing to come to DC and take care of packing and sorting of his office. The intention of the university was and still is to create a Gerard Mannion archive containing documents pertaining to his life and projects. There were shelves full of material there, and they needed someone to go through them and decide what is important and what not. You, of course, realize how sensitive this process is. Since Gerard talked to me about almost everything, I was the best person for the job, so I was told. I was, of course, reluctant. The news of his death were still fresh, and I have a hard time dealing with the fact that he is not with us anymore. But I decided to accept it and to do this last thing for him. In the outbreak of Corona, I packed my things and I went to spend the week in the White House in DC. I'm of course referring to the Andrew White House, the home of Jesuits in Georgetown, not the other White House, the home of, well, never mind. He wouldn't want us to say his name on this occasion. Father Dan Madigan was the one that generously invited me to stay there, although I'm Orthodox. And I'm gratefully accepted his invitation, although I'm Orthodox. Those of you who know a bit about the history of Orthodox and Jesuit relations will understand the joke. Upon my arrival, I had a half day to rest. On one occasion, Gerard explicitly instructed me that when I come to US, I should not sleep the first day, but go to a bar and preferably stay late. That will cure your jet lag, he explained. But since I'm not drinking, I decided to spend the afternoon in the National Gallery of Art. That will surely wear me off, I thought. I actually used to go a lot there when I would come to visit DC or to visit Gerard. I remember one such occasion when I was visiting him for 3 or 4 days, and I stayed in his apartment, and he did as much as he could to spend as much time possible with me. He did have to work one morning because he had some meetings, so he suggested that I should spend it in town doing something I prefer. Once the meetings were done, he would just call me and we can agree where we will meet. I went to the National Gallery, and after seeing everything I wanted to see there, I sat in front of one painting and I was looking at it for quite some time when I felt the hand on my shoulder. It was Gerard. I asked, "How did you find me? And how did you know I'm here in the gallery?" And he said, "Where else would you be?" And smiled like it was the most apparent thing in the world. Anyway, to get back to my original story about packing things in his office. I was in that room on numerous occasions, but upon entering it that time, I felt empty. The room was empty, I was empty. Although almost everything was the same as it was before. They left it in a way that it was when he locked the doors last time. Just think of it, him putting a key in his door and locking it. Just a normal thing you do every day. And that is the last time you do this in your life. His running shoes were there, a huge pack of wet wipes in the drawer that saved my life during that week because you could not buy any in the city because of Corona. On the wall, there was a photo of Dome of St. Peter's Basilica and the small helicopter flying away from it. I gave this photo to him when I visited DC in 2013 for the conference we organized there. He looked at it and said, "I don't get it. It's a photo of a helicopter and dome of St. Peter. What is this? I said, this is the photo of Pope Benedict XVI leaving the Rome at his last day in office as the Pope. This will hang on my wall for the rest of my life, he said. And I think he said something else about hanging, but I can't remember what he said back then. Everything in the office was same and yet so much different. The sense of someone being and suddenly not being was overwhelming, probably because in Gerard's case, being was so strong. I never met anyone who enjoyed life as much as he did. He always tried to squeeze the last drop of companionship, friendship, socializing, and the last drop of something else also. Anyway, Father Dan gave me the key of his office and he left for Australia. I started sorting his book first. Besides book on ecclesiology, ethics, and other theological and non-theological topics, there were quite a lot of biographies. He used to say that he enjoyed reading those because you can learn so much from the mistakes of other theologians and instead of doing these mistakes yourself. It actually took 3 days to pack all of his books and sort them out. After that, I began packing his other documents. I decided to divide everything in groups: his lectures, book projects, applications, meetings, conferences. To my surprise, I discovered that he actually kept all of his papers from his studies in Cambridge and Oxford, his notebooks from the lectures he listened to, courses he held later when he began to teach at Leeds, in Tübingen, Leuven, San Diego. Even some college stuff was there. All meticulously saved if he ever needs them. And this is when I realized I'm packing a life here. It all fitted in 40 or so boxes. But even if someone reads everything that is in them, he or she will never be able to know what kind of person he was. Generous, kind, friendly, and full of life. We all miss him. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Vladimir, for your very moving description and presentation of Gerard's life. I would now like to introduce the next three speakers, Peter, Cristina, and Brian. Brian Flanagan is an Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Marymount University. His research focuses on ecclesiology, ecumenism, and Jewish-Christian dialogue, particularly through the Ecclesiological Investigations Network and the Ecclesiological Investigations Group of the American Academy of Religion. He teaches Marymount's foundational theological inquiry course and upper-level courses in ecclesiology, Christology, and sacramental theology. Cristina Lledo Gomez is a systematic theologian and the Presentation Sisters Lecturer for Broken Bay Institute, the Australian Institute of Theological Education. She is also Pastoral Associate for Staff at Australian Catholic University and a Religion and Society Research Fellow for Charles Sturt University's Public and Contextual Theology Centre. She is the author of Church as Woman and Mother, Historical and Theological Foundations, published in 2018. Peter Phan is the inaugural holder of the Ignacio Ellacuria Chair of Catholic Social Thought in the Georgetown University Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and a faculty fellow at the Berkley Center. His research deals with the theology of icons in Orthodox theology, patristic theology, eschatology, the history of Christian missions in Asia, and liberation, enculturation, and interreligious dialogue. He is the author and editor of over 30 books and has published over 300 essays. In 2010, he received the John Courtney Murray Award, the highest honour bestowed by the Catholic Theological Society of America for outstanding achievement in theology, and he has earned 3 doctorates. So I will now invite Peter, Cristina, and Brian to each offer their reflections.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here, and it's a real an honor to have been invited by the Berkley Center, by the Ecclesiological Investigations Network, by all of you to be part of this conversation, remembering Gerard. And we were told to sort of sum up our statements in 8 to 10 minutes. So how do you talk about a life? How do you talk about a scholar? How do you talk about a friend to so many of us in 8 to 10 minutes? What I'd like to do is, in thinking about this, who was Gerard as a theologian and as an ecclesiologist, and how does that impact the way we do our theology, the way many of us do our ecclesiology? And I have 4 ideas or 4 examples that Gerard set for us about how to do ecclesiology, what ecclesiology should be, and then who we should be as part of his legacy. The first is that Gerard always had an ecclesiology that was dialogical, that was rooted in dialogue, not as an add-on, not as an also, not as something to do on the side if you have time, but an ecclesiology deeply rooted in dialogue between peoples who differ. And you can see that even in the people who are here on this, serving on this call, even seeing the participants, when you look at the participants list here on the Zoom, seeing all the people from various worlds, various churches, various religious traditions from around the world in different time zones right now, who Gerard's valuing of dialogue brought together in a way that is impressive and a hard act to follow. And he also was not into dialogue just as a sense of being nice. He wrote that he didn't want to sort of have what he called a woolly pluralism, but he said that we should have the courage to live with tensions, even with conflict and disagreements in our life. Dialogue for him was not just being nice, and if you knew him, you knew he would be perfectly happy to argue a point with you for as long as it took for him to convince you, usually over some sort of beverage. We are called in our ecclesiology, I think, to keep that dialogue on. You can see that the Ecclesiological Investigations Research Network is just such a place in which that's supposed to happen. A second thing about Gerard's ecclesiology that reflects who he was as a person is that his ecclesiology was always carried out from below rather than from above. It was always the fruit of a wide and searching sense of all of the voices in the room and an attempt to get as many people around the table of conversation as possible. It was not the imposition of an ecclesiology from Gerard's head produced into a book and then distributed to the world. And you can see from what Vladimir just said about, I think it's not entirely it's not even strange that his work was his masterwork, his magnum opus never quite happened, because his energy, his passion was in doing theology together, doing theology in conjunto, the way our Latinx theologian friends would say, of edited volumes, conferences where you could invite as many people as possible, giving everyone shorter speaking spots, whether they were a super senior scholar or a first-year doctoral student, to make sure that we all have some way of talking, to value everyone's voice. It wasn't just in his written theology that happened, though, too. If you ever were with him at a conference and were invited along to dinner, you would know that everyone else would eventually be invited along to dinner as well, whether that was the theologians, whether that was the new graduate students he had just met, whether that was the bartender at the reception who had just gotten off his or her shift. He valued people, and he was no respecter of persons. He wanted everyone to have their voice be part of our theology of church. The third thing I would say about Gerard and his ecclesiology is he looked for an ecclesiology that is virtuous. And I think one of the underused themes from Gerard's work that we have much work to expand and deploy is the idea of a virtue ecclesiology, when he wrote that the church's institutional facets should always aspire to be the embodiment of the love of the caritas that Christians believe is expressive of the very being of God. He He wrote that our considerations of what the church is and what the church does must always go hand in hand. And that virtue ecclesiology, looking to form a community that is holy and not just individuals that are holy, looking to form a community that is doing good in the world and that is prophetic. We forget something crucial about Gerard's work and legacy if we think that being loving means being silent. And one thing that we can see in our own world today and in our conversations is, I hear myself, Gerard's voice saying, are you challenging power with truth? Are you speaking up in justice for the underheard? Are you putting your ecclesiology into the real world and trying to create a wider church community and a wider world community in which justice is done? Which brings me to my fourth point about Gerard and about his ecclesiology. He defined ecclesiology in one text as the science of envisioning the church. And he said later that ecclesiology is above all an aspirational undertaking. The idea of ecclesiology as aspirational, as saying not just what is, but what could be, or more accurately, what should be, is a crucial part of what Gerard did with us and for us, and what he did for the church that he loved and for the community of God's people that he loved. He had a sense that one could not deny differences, one could not pretend that everything was just fine, but that you could live into those differences, live into a future. In some ways, he accepted the already of our divisions between Christians, our divisions between peoples, our lack of virtue or our lack of charity, but he never accepted that. And he always tried to live into the not yet of God's reign, into the not yet of a church that was as holy as it hoped to be, of a people that were as loving as they claimed to be, of a world that was as full of love as he thought it could be. And so I would never describe Gerard as pious in any kind of conventional sense. I remember being at church with him, and church would end and he was ready to go. But I would describe him, and I would even say he's sort of impatient with verbal pieties that didn't match people's lived out practice. But he was faithful to our God and to the people that God loved and served, hopeful, especially for the church. He did his work not out of despair for the church in its future, but out of hope for the church in its future, and love for God, for God's people, for God's creation. It leaves a large space for us to fill. It leaves a challenge for me as a theologian. Is my work living up to that aspirational idea of ecclesiology? And is my life living up to that aspirational work of ecclesiology? In the Catholic Christian tradition, we talk about the communion of the saints. And Gerard, like Dorothy Day, would be the last person who would want our attributing sainthood to him to get us off the hook. But he provides a concrete example for me of what the gospel looks like in practice, and has provided that for some time. So while we miss him, we believe that he is still with us, still praying with us, still working with us. And we hope from that we can be as faithful, as hopeful, as loving, as aspirational as he was. Thank you.
Let me begin with how Gerard might describe himself. The words Irish, lover of rugby, lover of music from Andrea Bocelli to Pink, vegetarian, supporter of the underdog, loyal friend, brother, uncle, nephew, son, and of course, theologian, would probably appear in there somewhere. Over the years of our friendship, I came to realize Gerard and I agreed on many things, particularly when it came to supporting the underdog and being unafraid to do the menial work, if that's what it took to get things done. Gerard was always on the side of inclusivity, always attuned to the dynamics of race, class, and diversity. Having achieved access to spaces of privileged academic and ecclesial conversation, he worked to make the circle wider. This way of operating seemed to be inseparable from his Irish roots and also his family culture. The way he was brought up meant social justice was very much a part of the upbringing of the Mannion children. Gerard's loyalty to the underdog is exemplified by his support of the same losing soccer team for over 30 years and his support of rugby union. Gerard's support for the underdog naturally translated into his faith and theological work in his consistent practice of the preferential option for the poor, whether it was women, early scholars, migrants, the LGBTI community, and other groups in the academy and church who were marginalized. Gerard either stood up for them or gave them a platform to be heard, and he communicated their equal dignity by treating them as his equal. He was a prominent scholar, but there were no airs and graces, no speaking down to us who were new and inexperienced. Instead, he was welcoming and generous in his encouragement. To borrow from Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, he nurtured theological spaces in which each was valued as among a discipleship of equals. While for some people, the church is daily becoming a losing institution as it becomes more irrelevant to a growing secular world, and tiresome because it moves at a snail's pace in regard to its own transformation. For Gerard, the church was and still is the means for building God's reality on earth. He saw his untiring work as a theologian was to encourage all members of the church to live up to their mission of being priestly, prophetic, and servant leaders, builders of the good news, God's reality here on earth as it is in heaven. He also was unafraid to call out the bad behavior of the church, seeking to reform by pointing to Vatican II principles and basic principles of common decency and courtesy. Gerard built God's reality on earth principally through his writing. He believed you could dismantle unjust systems, transform and fire up hearts for action by writing profusely. Gerard was a public theologian and constantly asked the question, what does this theological concept do for the everyday life of a person? If it helps him or her and alleviate his or her suffering, that's worth pursuing. If not, for whom does the writing serve? One of Gerard's final and finest works was his reinterpretation of magisterium. For Gerard, magisterium was not simply the body of teachings of the church derived from popes and councils, but was the magisterium of, by, and for the people of God, derived from the Sensus Fidelium. It was his attempt to empower the laity and resist inequity and divisions between laity and clergy. Gerard had a religious-like obsession with rugby. He even told me once it was a choice between becoming a rugby player or a theologian. Gerard also once considered becoming a school teacher and settling down in Leeds with his then girlfriend, thinking it was the sensible thing to do. He said of that time, I sometimes really curse my younger self for stupid idealism, but then I realized it was part of the whole package that makes me what, who, as I am, for good or for ill. Indeed, Gerard's idealism and resistance to following what is conventional and rather having a preference to take the road less taken, to face difficulties head on, was who he was and explained what he contributed to theology. Writings that understood the complexities of life, writings that were confronting and never danced around an issue, writings that respected the whole gamut of life's experiences, which included getting it so terribly wrong sometimes. Imagine then if Gerard had not become a theologian. There would be one less talented voice promoting Pope Francis and his plan of ecclesial reform, one less professor who was not caught up in him or herself, but rather took seriously the student and the early career theologian, one less theologian who embraced aggiornamento via ressourcement. I wonder too if the Ecclesiological Investigations Network would have been born, and if it had, how differently would it look like without the combination of his generous sense of hospitality, his radical inclusivity, and his way of bringing people together and making them feel they were the only person in the world. The EIN has certainly made a difference to me, initially as a PhD student and now as an early career researcher. I remember quite vividly as a bright-eyed PhD student how international theological conferences made me feel significantly insignificant. I had no professorial or research title. I was attached to some unknown university from some faraway continent where big rats called kangaroos supposedly jumped around in our backyards. I am a woman who was assumed to be the handbag of her husband, who was assumed to be doing his PhD when I brought him along to conferences. I am also a Filipina, assumed to be a maid. I was even asked at one AAR conference to clean a conference attendee's room when it was very clear I was not part of the hotel staff. Looking back to my early days of undertaking my PhD, I felt out of place on so many levels. The intersectional experience in the academy as a lay Asian Australian woman and a PhD student. But at the EIN, I had an equal place. And more than that, I had the chance to encounter another and practice real ecumenical dialogue as opposed to its theoretical vision. One of Gerard's greatest frustrations was the promotion of a type of dialogue in ecumenism that was risk-free, where participants were nice to each other, but never truly confronted the real issues. Gerard took pride in what EIN did, saying, "I'm pretty proud we include the hard sayings and difficult questions and methods in the EI events." In a similar way, Gerard believed all theology must be practical, explaining, "I've often banged my head to say, especially to practical theologians, that all theology is practical. That is, they should have practical implications and outcomes. And if it isn't, it may as well be a nice intellectual puzzle, but it's fairly pointless." As much as Gerard can be disturbingly confronting, his favorite saying among others was, "You can attract more flies with honey than vinegar." Gerard believed that friendship had a capacity not only to overcome differences, but also ultimately to undo the damage of systemic injustice. Because people who share a love that comes from authentic friendship will seek to find a way forward towards the common good, even if those friends have completely opposing theological ideas. This is also the way of Pope Francis and his push for integral ecology. Feminist theologians, post-colonial theologians, eco-theologians, and ecumenical theologians all have argued for the first principles of listening, dialogue, friendship, and interrelationship. Gerard understood and lived those principles. For some, his theological work made perfect sense, especially in light of the aims of Vatican II. For others, Gerard was too much ahead of his time and would only make sense in the future to come. Our world is all the richer because of what he gave each of us, but also his contribution to the academy and society. May you, Gerard, now enjoy the banquet of God's table to which you invited people to while here on earth. Slón awalye, slón gafoil.
And we'll now hear a reflection from Phan.
Good afternoon. First of all, welcome to all of you who attend this seminar, web seminar in honor of Gerard Mannion. It is a great honor for me to have the opportunity to offer a memorial to Gerard Mannion on the first anniversary of his sudden and tragic death. His passing deprived his family and loved ones, and his friends and colleagues all over the world of his delightful and gregarious presence, and the Academy and the Church of his theological insights and his many activities to promote collaboration among theologians especially the younger ones around the globe. In this memorial, I will not attempt to assess Mannion's theological legacy. I leave that task to my more theological astute colleagues. At any rate, it would be impossible to do justice to Mannion's theological productions in a span of about 10 minutes. Instead, I will share with you the friendship that binds two of us for nearly 2 decades. Mannion and I first met in March 2003 at the Yale Law School during a conference on church governance in the aftermath of the scandal of clerical sexual abuse, grievously aggravated by the inept and equally scandalous handling of it by church leaders. Mannion, then just a mere 33 years old, spoke about the clerical sexual abuse in Europe, especially in Ireland, England, and Wales. And with deep passion and learned eloquence, he discussed 7 aspects of the, he called, ecclesiological question, which helped to overcome the scandal and restore credibility to the church. These 7 aspects, which are the building blocks of Mannion's ecclesiological architecture, are wider synodality and collegiality, subsidiarity, participation, consultation, communication, democracy, and ownership of decisions, procedures, and visions. I spoke of the new way of being church in Asia, which I describe as the rejection of the church-centered ecclesiology and adoption of the kingdom of God-centered and kenotic ecclesiology. Without previous consultation, Mannion's lecture and mine substantially complemented each other, a fact indicated by the editors of the conference volume, who placed our pieces one after another and wisely put Mannion's piece before mine. The next year, Mannion invited me to deliver a series of lectures on Asian ecclesiologies at Liverpool Hope University in Liverpool, England, where he was senior lecturer in theology. He extended to me his trademark generous hospitality, showed me around Liverpool, especially the Cavern Club, the birthplace of the Beatles. Also, typically of Gerard's concern for social justice, he brought me to the Council of Public Housing to witness how the poor lived and what the church was or was not doing for them. Of course, also typically of Gerard, he made sure that my stay in Liverpool was not restricted to academic matters and offered me a tour of the city's many bars. One evening, after the pub crawl, we were heading home. At one point, Gerard asked me if it was too late for another drink for the road. I said, Mannion, it's never too late for a drink. Looking at me, he said, Phan, you are a man after my own heart. I knew then that we would be friends for life. In 2008, Mannion became director of the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture at the University of San Diego. After a 2-year stint, he became disillusioned by the restrictions imposed on his theological ideas and visions, and so he wanted to move. One night, he called me and asked if there was any opening at Georgetown University. I said, indeed there was, the Amaturo Chair in Catholic Studies. The next day, I brought Gerard's CV to the chair and said that I had found the ideal candidate. The rest is history. Georgetown is where Gerard spent the longest period of his academic career, enriching it with his theological scholarship and entrepreneurship, his ecclesiological investigation, international research network, his association with the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and his co-founding of the Global Irish Studies Initiative. After his arrival, Gerard was looking to buy a home, a house. I took him to the complex in Alexandria, Virginia, where I live, and I contacted a real estate agent. An elegant young lady showed us several townhomes. I noted that she was reluctant to extol their amenities, especially the luxurious master bedrooms and ensuite bathrooms, to two men. She casually dropped a hint that the neighborhood is very gay-friendly. As she left us alone to inspect the house, I told Gerard to play along, which he did to perfection. Sadly, our house hunting did not work out because Gerard preferred to live in DC where all the action is, to the monkish lifestyle of my neighborhood. Happily, since we were now living not far from each other, Gerard often came to spend the weekends and holidays with me, often in the company of Dales Irvin, the then president of New York Theological Seminary. I can tell you that we never went to bed before 2 or 3 in the morning. Strongly fortified by Holy Spirits, we tried to solve all the ills and problems that were besetting the church and the ecumenical world. Luckily, we did not remember the solution we proposed the next day. Otherwise, there would have been a revolution in the church. In 2016, Gerard organized a panel on and a festive celebration of my theology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, complete with champagne and garlands of flowers. The following year, he organized a 2-day international symposium on my work at Georgetown, the papers of which Gerard was later to edit into a book, a task that our colleague Leo Lefebvre has generally taken over and has already completed. I am deeply grateful to Gerard for these 2 infomercials, without which I would have remained but an obscure theological wordsmith. On Saturday, September 21st last year, I left for Germany to give a lecture at the University of Bamberg. Gerard had told me the previous day that he would leave for Rome the following day, and we wished each other a safe and enjoyable trip and planned to see each other after our return. On the following Tuesday, I got up at 2 a.m. local time in Germany, as I could not sleep because of the time difference. I checked my email, and it was then that I read the message about Gerard's death, sent by our chair, Bill Wopahowski, who kindly apologized for announcing the sad news by email because he could not reach me by phone. In my shock, I took Bill's phrase that Gerard had been struck while jogging to mean that he was hit by a car, and so I misinformed his friends of the cause of his death. I could not explain how a healthy young man could have died suddenly otherwise. Upon my return, I was able to see Gerard for the last time, a reunion of sorts, as he was laid out in a casket, an empty shadow of his former self. I was able to honor Gerard with a eulogy at Georgetown and at Roscommon, Ireland, where he was buried. On both occasions, I could see how much Gerard was loved and missed by his friends and family. Because of lack of time, I cannot honor Gerard's memory with more personal stories, but also because what happened at Phan stays at Phan. But we can and must do what Gerard would have done in theological scholarship and service to the church and the world. Dear Gerard, we hear your voice calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and the rose is dying. Soon the valleys hushed and white with snow. One day we hope to come to the place where you are lying and kneel and say an Ave for you. And your grave shall be warmer, sweeter, for we will bend and tell you that we love you. And you should sleep in peace until we meet again on the day of the resurrection of the dead. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, Cristina, and Peter. We ask those of you who are participating in the webinar to begin now to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom page to write in your comments and questions. You can address the panel as a whole, or you can address one particular person. You can also offer your own brief reflections. We are going to start taking those questions and comments in about 15 minutes, and what we will try to get to as many as possible. But first, we want to invite Trish and Leo to join the conversation with Brian, Cristina, and Peter, to give you all a chance, along with Vladimir and Mark, if you were willing to do so, to talk about the legacy you all share, to ask each other questions, make comments. We'll do that for about 15 minutes. And then we will turn to the rest of the participants and open up for further conversation.
Yeah, I would like to thank everyone who has spoken and just underline one comment that I think Cristina made in passing is Gerard's devotion to the younger generation, to the graduate students, that he was tireless in supporting them and taking them out for dinners and making connections for them and getting them involved, even at an early stage in their scholarship, in being productive and helping to plan and carry out international conferences and really pushing them to publish even before they might feel like they were ready for it. I think that's going to be a huge legacy as we look to the future.
Others?
I think just to add to that, I remember Gerard telling me a story where he taught a class at Georgetown University and then afterwards invited his students to a meal. And the students were just, you know, so overwhelmed by his hospitality. But, you know, it just made them feel important. And, you know, he could have been doing other things. But yeah, that's who Gerard was. He not only fostered, you know, new research and young students, but also just made them feel like they were somebody and they were worth it.
Yes, I too also thought that I also benefited very much from Gerard's generosity and his inclusion. And I always noticed that at the ecological investigations conferences, there was always women on the panels. There were women chairs, and once I complimented him on that and said, you really do a good job about including women. And he just looked at me and he said, "We try." And I thought that was just so lovely, and that was a part of his generosity, and his inclusion was what I most appreciated.
Let me ask a question on that. How did Gerard reconcile this fundamental democratic impulse regarding both scholarship and ecclesiology with the fundamental hierarchical nature of the church as it was affirmed by Vatican II, a church he loves so much?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, the Vatican II didn't only talk about the hierarchical nature of the church, it also talked about it reinvigorated the idea of all of the baptized as the church. It reinvigorated the idea of everyone's voice being important within that. So it repositioned hierarchy or ministerial service as a network of voices that could be in harmony with different outlooks rather than as a strict pyramid at the top. So I think I was thinking about this a minute ago. I mean, Vatican II has kept coming up in our remarks from Gerard. He's a real son of Vatican II, in as much as he's a son of Ireland and a son of the church in general, and that this major reevaluation and revalorization of the baptized was so much a part of his way of thinking about his own fellow church members.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Gerard's style of thinking was often both and. So what you're saying is completely true, Dale, and also the hierarchy for him. So yes, he's in favor of the whole democratic side of the church, but he also loved hobnobbing with Vatican officials and would follow the latest Vatican politics. And he was a great promoter of Pope Francis. So he was not against papal authority. He wanted it channeled in ways that he thought would be productive. So I think this is part of his kind of organic approach to the nature of the Catholic Church, that he didn't want to choose between one side or the other. He'd be very critical of aspects that were not helpful, but hold them together and grow as we move forward.
So I would like to say also something. There is a question now from Jody, and it says, "It has been beautiful to listen to Gerard's achievements and all your amazing memories. Thank you for sharing." Gerard's niece, Jody, much love to you all. So I would like to say to Jody that we are happy to be here and to commemorate Gerard. And I would also like to say another thing is that many people from his family told me after his death that they didn't knew that he's so important, which also shows another thing that Gerard was. He was very humble. He never spoke about what he was doing to his family. Even his sisters didn't know what kind of huge name he was in ecclesiology. So this is a thing that definitely very much appreciated, that he was a humble, a man who was with both feet on the ground, and that was always fighting for those that are weak. So this is one of the things that I appreciated the most.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I may say something, several years ago, I was contacted by a reporter for Time magazine asking me to write something about the American bishops with regard to the sexual abuse scandal. I felt that it's a very dangerous topic, so I said, I know somebody who can do a much better job than I. His name is Gerard Mannion. So he contacted Gerard Mannion, and Gerard Mannion came out with an essay in which he called for the resignation of all American bishops to start all over again. So, you know, how radical. He saved my skin by doing that instead of me, and the call for resignation of all, because it followed what happened, I think in Chile, I think where the bishop resigned. And he said that's the model that the American bishops should follow, just resign altogether and start from scratch. Obviously, it didn't happen, but at least he gave us some thought about how the church can move forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to start opening up now to our questions that are coming in. First of all, I simply want to read a reminder that Gerard's colleagues from St. Michael's College and Regis College in Toronto would like to add their voices and heartfelt tribute to him. We have included him, they write, posthumously as our co-editor of a publication out of an ecclesiological investigations conference, The Church, Migration, and Global Indifference, that is forthcoming this year. And they dedicated the book to him as a scholar, ecumenist, colleague, and friend. Darren Diaz, Yaroslav Skira, and Michael Attridge, thank you very much for that. Ted Dawson writes, Ted writes that he has no question, but he wants to confirm what's already been said by Professor Lefebvre and others, that Gerard Mannion was tremendously hospitable, kind, generous with his time and advice, and without him, many of us would have not had a chance to experience what we did in graduate school in such a positive and life-changing way. Others of you are writing in. I have a question for Leo. Can you say something about Gerard's final work that you have been editing?
Okay, what I have been editing is not actually a work that he wrote, but it was a process of picking up the papers from the conference on the work of Peter Phan that he was doing. So it's not a matter of a manuscript that Gerard began in writing in his own name, but it's a set of papers that Gerard had been intending to edit, but then unfortunately was not able to do it. So this is looking at the work of Peter Phan, so aspects of religious pluralism, aspects of migration, aspects of ecclesiology and eschatology. And so the spirit of Gerard runs through, and kind of like this volume we just heard about from our colleagues in Toronto, we're dedicating this book to the memory of Gerard Mannion. And both Peter and I evoke Gerard and thank him posthumously for his contribution to this volume in my introduction and in Peter's epilogue.
Mm-hmm. We have a number of people talking on the personal side about how much they miss Gerard. Let me ask a question that's come up. One of you noted his resistance to restrictions imposed by a Catholic university. But what restrictions did Gerard impose upon himself, if any?
Well, perhaps I can answer that question because it's a rather personal question, but we all sacrifice a lot for the job that we are doing. I mean, if you're in academia, the family always suffers if they are the first ones that don't get enough attention. I think that the biggest sacrifice that he made is probably family. He loved children, he loved playing with children, talking with them. And, you know, with this way of life that he was leading, that was probably the biggest restriction that he had to deal with traveling every week somewhere else. It was not possible or hard to have family. He still hoped that he will have family, but probably this is the biggest sacrifice that he made for this.
Hmm.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, I remember talking to him sometimes, and he would say, "I haven't talked to my sisters for weeks, and I feel so bad." But that was because he was helping students, or you know, editing a book, or doing, you know, going to another conference. But even with that, he still made time to see his sisters and his family, and he did that as regularly as he could.
Mm-hmm.
And just also on the restrictions too, I think he also tried to be consistent himself with his beliefs. So if he, you know, that's why he became a vegetarian, because you know, it was just unethical to you know, on so many levels. And he convinced his own dad too, who was, this, Irish man who, loves meat, to become a vegetarian. So that's a pretty big feat to convince your dad who loves meat, Irishman, to become a vegetarian.
And if I might say, another restriction in some ways goes back to what Trish said when Trish was appreciating the work that he did to make our panels as inclusive as possible, is that his response, "We try," I think is telling, in that one of his restrictions, or he was never satisfied. He knew that we needed to do more, even when on things that we were doing okay on. It was a sort of a way in which he had a kind of permanent theological rock in his shoe, and was also going to make sure the church had a kind of permanent rock, him if necessary, to say there's still more we can grow into, more we can do, more we can better approximate the reign of God.
I have a question from Sandra Arenas from Catholic University of Temuco, Chile. She writes, "I just want to thank you for creating this virtual space. I have felt it as a way of listening and feeling Gerard among us. And thinking about Gerard and about changing the church implies for me, as a Latin American laywoman, as much inclusivity as possible. As an open question, what are the main issues to be taken for making this inclusivity possible?" And that's to all of you.
Well, go Peter.
If one aspect of this inclusivity in the church, the one thing that Gerard and Irvin and me, we all drink up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And the topic is always about ecumenical unity because of Gerard's fundamental concern for it, and because of the work of Dale Irving in terms of ecumenical unity. I just stood there and listened to them and see them debating and talking about one particular topic is the Eucharistic sharing. Gerard is very much for it. And so there's this one way of thinking. The questioner asked what aspect that he would push for this inclusivity is sacramental and Eucharistic sharing. I remember he organized a conference at AAR on the document of the World Council of Churches towards a common vision. And he himself was not very satisfied with what the product in the book, and he pushed further, as I myself was part of the panel at that afternoon. And we were saying that, the document of World Council of Churches summarized very well what has been done up to that point, but doesn't open up for the future. I think that's what Gerard would push for, for the total inclusion of all churches.
Mm-hmm.
And there you work so much in ecumenical theology, and you were witness to our debate in our home. So maybe you wouldn't remember anything we said, given there's so much Holy Spirit among us.
Gerard always remembered, though, and made it a point to remind you the next day of everything that we had talked about. He absorbed it all and took it into his spirit. I have a question from Jason Well for Brian, which follows up on this in many ways. The category of a virtual ecclesiology was mentioned earlier, but virtue ethics is often criticized for being elitist. Is there a tension between a virtue approach and the dedication to inclusion that marks Gerard's career?
Yeah, it's a great question, but there's and I was rereading a lot of Gerard's stuff to get ready for this. He himself makes that distinction between a kind of virtue ecclesiology, a kind of a Benedict option, or more of a Hauerwasian thing, where the church would turn in and form a distinct community of virtue over and against the world. And he and I think that the danger there is that creates a church that doesn't realize it's always already part of a world, part of history, with all of its ups and downs, with all of its gifts and all of its challenges, sometimes sinful. So I think when Gerard talks about a virtue ecclesiology, he is thinking about how can communities exercise their moral life in ways that are flexible, in ways that are particular, in ways that actually look a lot more like the kind of practical ecclesiology he's created in many worlds, of a community that is trying to think, how do we live out the gospel, not just how do I live out the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? I will move on to another question. Coylin Parsons, who co-directs the Global Center for Irish Studies at Georgetown University, writes in that he says that it's been so good to hear about Gerard's humanity. He's been moved by it. Would like to hear more about Gerard's, and he says, we at Global Studies will miss him. We're grateful to have had the opportunity to work him. Can any of the panelists say more about Gerard's interest in Ireland and how it intersected with his work on the church?
A few years ago, I was editing a volume of essays based on the Ecclesiological Investigations Conference in Belgrade, Serbia, on religious freedom and church-state relations. And Gerard wrote an essay for this volume on the Irish Revolution, the Easter Rising, and theology. So he was very much involved in the current world in studying liberation theology, different movements for justice, challenges to structures of injustice. And then he brought those questions to the study of the leaders of the Easter Rising. And so he was challenging some of the Irish historiography that saw it in a more secular vein. And he was stressing the strictly theological role of a number of the actors in that. So that'd be one example.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps I can offer another example. And I'm doing my postdoctoral work on Pelagius. And for Pelagius, it's not sure where he was from. I mean, in the Latin language, it said Scotus for him, so he could have been from Britain or Ireland. You know, the word was used for both. So I often argue with Gerard about this, and he claimed that the Pelagius was definitely Irish because he was such a decent guy compared to Augustine. So he definitely had to be Irish. This was the main argument that Gerard had.
Cristina also earlier used in her remarks, which were spot on, talked about Gerard always was on the side of the underdog, and you don't get much more underdog than a lot of Irish history in the last few centuries, and I think that reflects some of where his theology came from as well.
I could tell you another story about Gerard and Ireland. One time he and I and a group of members who attended EI on Vatican II in Toronto. And there was a reception that evening in the sister's house. I forget exactly the name of the convent. And there was an old sister. She must be 80 or something. And then I start saying, well, she asked who Gerard is. She said, well, I come from Ireland. And she asked me who I am. I said, I come from Vietnam. And I said to her, I say, sister, you know, every Irish want to be a Vietnamese because all Irish people come from Vietnam at one time and another. She said, no, impossible. That's not impossible. And Gerard would say, sister, I have documents, historical documents, to show that we Irish come from the Vietnamese. And so he just play up on that, how make sister get even more agitated than ever. And so she was kind of very agitated. She said, no, it's not true. All Irish never come from the Vietnamese. But she has a bit too much to drink. So she was kind of walk, and then she just slipped down. And oh, we were so worried. We said, oh, call the ambulance. And the man, the one who picked up the telephone said, what's that? Oh, so sister-in-law has just fallen. And he said, again? So that was the story about being Irish and Vietnamese and the old sister in Toronto.
I will say as a follow-up on that I'm teaching at Dale Irvin is teaching at Georgetown. Gerard's class on Irish, the religion in the Irish Revolution and the Vatican in Ireland, and keeping that legacy going as part of the global studies at Georgetown with some wonderful work that it's been building on what he started there. I have a question from Helen Mannion. Is it possible to ask how Gerard's work was viewed by the Vatican? It's possible to ask. Is it possible to answer? Would anyone like to say that? How was Gerard's work received in the halls of the Vatican?
Before Francis came, not very positive. There was a shut door for the ecclesiological investigation, and the situation started to improve after the Benedict XVI has left the office. So after that, Gerard actually, and after he began teaching at Georgetown, which has excellent connections in Vatican, the things began to improve. So after Francis came, Gerard was suddenly in.
And that might be a good note on which to draw our discussion to a close. One of the lessons that Gerard Mannion has taught us is that life goes very fast and that each day is very precious. As he delighted in good conversations, good colleagues, good friends, we have sought to honor his memory by continuing the conversations that he led in so many different venues around the world. And so I would like to thank our moderators, Trish and Dale, for their leadership in this conversation. And I'd like to thank all our panelists, Mark, Vladimir, Peter, Cristina, and Brian, for this wonderful and animating discussion. And I also thank all our participants for your attention and your comments and questions. In closing, I'd like to invite all of us to honor Gerard's legacy by continuing the activities that he deemed so important. May Gerard's memory and legacy be a blessing for each of us and for all the world. I thank you all.